Hello and welcome to the Career Success Podcast. I'm Jason Connolly. If you're a regular listener, it's great to have you back. But if you're new, welcome to the show. In this insightful and thought-provoking series, we speak to business leaders and people who have had high levels of career success, but also up-and-coming and emerging business talent. We speak to such a variety of people across a wide range of different industries, and we speak about their stories, their backgrounds, the trials and tribulations in order to reach the top. Over recent episodes, there's been some really interesting stories. We also talk about success habits and what these people do in order to ensure they stay at the top of their game. Listen and find out hints and tips to help you in the world of business. How do you set up your own business and make sure it's a success? How to drive business growth and get your company noticed. Practical advice to help you in your career from those who have made it. In this episode, I'm joined by Peter Kozodoy. Peter is the author of Honest to Greatness: How Today's Greatest Leaders Use Brutal Honesty to Achieve Massive Success. Peter is an Inc. 5000 serial entrepreneur, TEDx speaker and business coach who works with organizations and their leaders to help them overcome self-limiting, brutal dishonesty and rubbish, and how to use honesty to achieve greatness. His articles on leadership and entrepreneurship have featured in Forbes, the Huffington Post, PR Daily, and more. He holds a BA in economics from Brandeis University and an MBA from Columbia Business School. He lives just outside New York City with his wife and their spoiled dog. Peter, thanks so much for joining me on this episode. It's great to have you on the show.
My pleasure, Jason.
So first of all, your TEDx talk, Honest to Greatness, I was watching it earlier on today. It's really, really interesting. A lot of our conversation today is going to be about honesty with your book, with the TEDx talk and everything that you do. But how did this all kind of come about for you in sort of going onto this path about honesty? How did this all kind of get started?
Yeah, interesting thing. When you write a book about honesty, you get to be honest, right? So the truth is, Jason, I never set out to write about, speak about, or frankly, even care about honesty. It wasn't even on my radar. I actually sat down to write what I thought was a marketing book. And the marketing book came out of my frustrations of having seen just all the leaders and boardrooms that I had, worked in and for since I started my first company at 22, just out of college. And, over the years, we worked with everyone from startups to the Fortune 500 and even Warren Buffett himself. And I could never quite figure out this weird phenomena that I saw. My clients would fall into two camps. The first camp, we would go into their frontline employees and customers and do surveys and focus groups and unearth all these great insights and bring it back to the executive team. We're like, okay, this is what they're saying. This is who they think you are and what you need to be. And this is what we need to do. And some of our clients would take that and go like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Let's do that. And they would just crush it. They would get 5-6 times ROI with us. We'd make them millions of dollars. They'd stay with us for years. Others, we would do the same kind of work. Frontline employees, customers, here's what they say, here's what they think, here's what they need to do, here's what they think you are, here's what needs to change. And they would look at it and they would just like blow up on the launch pad. They would descend into ego and infighting and politics. And well, I guess that's what the data says, but I don't really think that's true. And then like what? And I just couldn't figure out. It baffled me. So I sat down to write, a marketing book, queried 400 literary agents, most of whom did not get back to me, many of whom did get back to me and said, please never email me again. You're never going to be an author. You suck. And 3 of them took a meeting and one of them actually signed me. And as soon as he did, he said, by the way, Peter, this isn't really a book about marketing. It's a book about honesty. And I said, well, I just signed with the only literary agent in the world who I can't read, apparently, because this has nothing to do with honesty. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. And lo and behold, as I went back and I was looking through it, I was like, okay, wow, he's absolutely right. This is much bigger than just marketing or sales. It's really about, what do we believe as leaders and as a society? And, what works to achieve outcomes in a business setting or even in life in a century where everyone's walking around with a smartphone, right? We have more transparency than ever before. What's working now, and it is this weapon I've coined as strategic, brutal honesty, and I've sort of made that my mission to help leaders and organizations understand that it's not about. Listen, I was very happy the book premiered as number 1 on Amazon, 2 categories. One of those categories was business ethics. Look, Jason, I think people should be ethical, right? I think they should be nice and moral and all that crap, but that's not what this book is about. This book is about how do you earn outsized profitability? How do you annihilate your competitors in a world that's more transparent than ever before? And the method is honesty.
Who was the target market for this book? Was it dishonest people or?
What's funny is I think it was my wife that pointed this out to me. She's like,
Right.
the people who really need to read this are the ones that will never pick it up. You know that, right? And I said, yeah, of course,
Yeah.
right? Of course.
How do you get them to read it?
I hope that the book ends up, naturally
Yeah.
towards the folks that really need it. But in addition, I wrote this book for the folks that actually get it. Who work in cultures that are misaligned, right? Who work under leaders who don't embrace the truth, don't look at the data and make rational, objective decisions. Because it's like, hey, you're not alone. You're not crazy. There actually are leaders out there who understand honesty, who weaponize honesty. I tell the stories of a ton of them, from
Mm.
Quicken Loans to Domino's Pizza to Berkshire Hathaway to Bethany Frankel to an 11-year-old Girl Scout that sold 30,000 boxes of Girl Scout cookies. I mean, over and over again, the way to achieve these outcomes was through honesty. So it's sort of, I would say,
Mm.
everyone in business, anyone who wants to understand, what it takes to have a transformation.
We're going to talk about this book definitely in more detail, but we're never going to unpack everything that this book has to offer through this half an hour. But it sounds to me initially that this book was wrote from a place of kind of frustration from you for being in these situations. Was it coming from that place, or was it coming from a place of more, trying to problem solve what the problems are at board level of these, big corporations or companies that you work with?
No, it was totally frustration. I mean, I tell people,
Mm.
if you want to write something you can be proud of and that's really compelling, ask yourself what really pisses you off. What do
Yeah.
you want to go out there and change? And I would, if that can be my legacy, and I've always sort of thought about life in terms of, the long term, right? In fact, I make the case that to be honest is to think long term and only long term, because that's really the wise thing to plan for, as many of the best leaders in the world or best investors in the world will tell you. What's interesting is I wrote it out of frustration in the way that we've talked about, right? Seeing
Hmm.
these leaders and just not being able to come up with an explanation for. I mean, listen, in every course I could have taken at undergrad, I took it at the business school, ended up back at Columbia, did an MBA. I can promise you, Jason, there is no course on what to do when the CEO abandons all sense of logic and rationale in favor of ego.
Yeah.
That is not a course title you're going to see, right? And yet you see
Mm.
it over and over and over again. So the first point of frustration was that. And the second point of frustration that's much more personal is I was going through, when I sat down to write this book, I was going through my own crisis of honesty. I had just crossed the 30 threshold and turned the big 3-0, and that was a devastating time in my life. And I really had to get honest about, who I even was, what I really wanted. I had built a 7-figure business that I wasn't even happy about. And it was like, what's going on here? What's really true here? And
Mm.
having to struggle to figure that out taught me the
Yeah.
personal side of honesty.
Right. Okay. You mentioned in university that people aren't kind of taught this. Do you think that people, because I often think that in universities people aren't taught kind of the real life skills of what they actually need. They're taught the theory and the practice behind, the industry of which they're in. But these real life skills are things that are a lot of the time omitted from kind of university courses and things like that. Do you agree?
Well, I think we sort of know, like we've all
Uh
seen
huh.
that thing, like, well, it's all about people.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's emphasized enough that, like, no, it's really, really about the people. Like, it's not about the spreadsheets, not about the valuation models, it's not about discounted cash flows. It's not like, it's about, do you understand human psychology? Do you understand honestly what makes them tick? Do you understand how groups of people work? And if you can understand that, you can absolutely kill it in business. And that fits into I use a framework in the book I call the Hourglass of Honesty. And the second level is getting honest with and about the others around you. And if you can understand that, if you can understand how to get honest with the people around you, personal and professional life, and how to get honest about the people around you, about their egos, their fears, their desires, their self-limiting beliefs, you can absolutely crush it in business, because so few folks take the time to be a studier of that, right?
It takes more though than just one person, to be honest. If you've got a company culture or you work in a company that has an inherent dishonest culture, I think a culture is something that it's really difficult to change a culture. Do you think that you can apply honesty to a company that maybe isn't used to working in that way? If one person speaks out, then is the kind of pendulum going to swing towards them of blame? And do you think it's something that it has to be a whole company culture of that honesty is the best policy for that to work?
It is absolutely, you can use honesty no matter who you are and where you are. If you're the janitor, if you're the CEO, if you're an entrepreneur of a startup, whatever, it
Mm,
doesn't matter. Honesty works universally. And in part 3 of the book, I actually take you through like, here's how to use it as an entrepreneur. Here's how to use it as a middle
yeah,
manager, right? But the thing is, we have to use it in different ways, right? This is the same weapon that when you change the warrior, it can't be wielded in the same way. So for instance, to your point, if you have a frontline employee or middle manager that's going to walk into the CEO's office and say, hey, you're a lying sack of crap, and this organization says that one of its core values is speed, and it's the slowest damn organization I've ever worked for in my life, and like, what's going
yeah.
on here? It's probably a good way to get fired, right? So there are tactics that I lay out in the book to get around that. One of them is don't go it alone. It's very easy for a manager to dismiss one wayward employee. It's very difficult to dismiss 10 of them.
Yeah.
Schedule a time on the calendar, walk in with a presentation, and make it together as a united front, saying like, here's what we're seeing, and because we care about the place we work in, because we want you to be successful, here's what we want to show you. And the second very important part of that, Jason, is bring data. This can't be like,
Mm,
we think and we feel and we believe. It's like, no, this is what the data is saying. And literally, I mean, people have said to me, like, now I have this whole book, Peter, that you wrote full of case studies. I can actually use these. And I'm like, yeah, no kidding. That's why I wrote it. So you can literally take these cases and say, hey, look at what can happen when we embrace honesty. And by the way, look at the opportunity cost we're incurring when we're not being honest in all these strategic and tactical ways. So it needs to be wielded. And I want everyone to feel empowered out there that no matter where you are in the organization, you can use this very effectively.
Did you have a kind of target end of was this book more aimed towards directors and CEOs, or was this kind of a one glove fits all guide to, achieving greatness no matter who you are, where you are, in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Jason, because it violates, my answer to your question about who's it for violates like the central tenet of marketing, right? Which is be
Okay.
narrow, right? Be
Yeah.
narrow, have a niche. And really, I mean, the thing is, if honesty is the best policy and every human being learned that at 2 years old, then shouldn't it work universally? And that's what
Mm,
I set out. That was the question in my mind. Where does this work and where doesn't it work? And how do I prove that one way or the other? And tell an honest story, right? And over the course of framing out the book, and thankfully my publisher was really helpful, because the first draft I wrote was, I think in the British parlance, absolute rubbish. I don't know if I captured the accent, but
oh,
that's what it
I
was.
felt the essence, most
Was it good?
definitely.
Yeah, good, good.
Yeah, perfect.
So what they helped
Mm,
me understand is, structurally, how do I lay this out in a way that accomplishes that exact goal? Does this work universally? And so part 2 of the book literally takes you through like, what does honesty look like, and how do you use it in sales, in marketing, in management, in culture, right? In
mm.
finance, in accounting, like all of the different facets of business. And lo and behold, I was able to find exceptional examples in every single one to help folks answer exactly that question, like what can it do for me? And of course, I talk, at the center of the book about getting honest with and about yourself, because oftentimes, like, let's
Mm,
be honest, right? How many of us run around trying to control the things we can't control? And meanwhile, the one thing we can control is
mm.
ourselves, and yet so few of us are willing to be honest with ourselves. And so we
I
give up
totally agree.
that ability. It's very sad.
With kind of honesty, do you think that the world is becoming generally more honest now in terms of business? Because you mentioned about transparency, about the world being more connected, and we all are more than ever. Do you think we're moving more towards an honest way of doing business, or do you think we haven't changed in the last decade? One of the examples that stood out to me in the TEDx talk that you did was you mentioned about Blockbuster, Netflix, and that kind of example. Do you think we're getting more honest as a kind of one world nation?
Yeah, what's funny is I've gotten the comment that, like, Peter, you say, it's a transparent world and we're getting more honest, but look at all the dishonesty out there. Look at all the corporate scandals. Look at all the
Yeah.
political scandals. Look at I turn to them and I smile and I say, yes, exactly, exactly. Now there's nowhere to hide. All of those things eventually come out. The truth comes out. We have that phrase in
Mm,
the English language, and that's what we're seeing. So while it can appear like we're more dishonest than ever. That is transparency at work. And so my thesis is that from here, humanity goes one of two directions. Either we descend into a global society in which we decide, yeah, let's just keep lying to each other. Let's just keep bullshitting each other. Let's just keep, nobody's going to tell the truth, and we're just going to see how that happens. Or people are going to say to themselves, if everyone's going to find out the truth anyway in the long run, maybe I should make a different choice here. I have hope that it's the latter. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you which one's which. But we do know, anyone with a child can tell you that humans behave differently in the dark than they do in the light. Right? When there's a camera on someone, or when mom and dad are watching, or you're going to behave differently. This is human nature. So what I'm hoping is we all recognize, social media and smartphones, and everyone's recording someone somewhere as that big spotlight, and begin to change our behavior. And I think listen, the evidence that we're moving that direction is all around us. I mean, we're having conversations about race, gender pay equity, political divides, all sorts of look at all the documentaries that are coming out about, hey, we thought this about food and now we know this about diet. And I mean, that it's upon us.
People are craving, aren't they, a level of exposure and a level of transparency. And I think Netflix is, one platform where you go on there and there's documentary after documentary about things that have been covered up and hidden. And I think I've always adopted an honest policy, so I could never imagine having a dishonest policy to business. But I can see businesses that I've worked with over the years that haven't had that policy, but haven't had that level of transparency, and where they've kind of fallen flat over the years. And even my business is kind of, I think the recruitment industry has an awful reputation as an industry anyway, of people not necessarily telling the truth. And I think that's why it's been so easy to stand out. One thing that I was reading here on the sort of case studies and interviews that you conducted at Bridgewater Associates, Quicken Loans, Domino's Pizza, the Ritz-Carlton, and so on. You had down here that you can attract and inspire the best talent in any industry who only really attract one thing. Now, I don't want to state the obvious, but is that honesty?
I had a Fortune 500 client for a while, right?
Yeah.
And I touched on this a little earlier. One of their core values was something like speed, okay? Every single initiative this company tried to do took forever. I mean, literally, they needed 18 sign-offs and 4 PowerPoint presentations, but people only ever looked at 2 of them, and way too many cooks in the kitchen, and they had to vet every alternative. It was a total pain in the neck to get anything done.
Yeah.
And here's the problem with that. People come in, they have an expectation. Speed. Okay, great. That's good. I resonate with speed. Okay. Now, 1 month in, they realize, well, that's weird. We had that meeting and initiative, and that's not moving fast at all. It must be a fluke. 2 months go by, 6 months go by, and now they're frustrated. They were excited that they were going to have speed, and now they don't have speed. And this is when you get really good people who leave. They leave because they're not a fit for the organization. They leave because they're not a fit with their boss, right? That's actually the number one reason. Who's usually carrying out an edict from the organization and their core values, culture. So this presents a massive problem for recruiting and retention. And the ping pong table in the corner is not going to make up for that. Now, imagine, Jason, if that company just said, you know what? One of our core values is being slow as hell. We love being slow. We love taking our time. We don't do anything quick. We like to dot our I's and cross our T's and vet every alternative. And then what would happen is they would attract people that are like, oh, thank goodness. I hate rushing. I love dotting my I's and crossing my T's. Like, this is fantastic. And they would feel at home. And that would be a much better way to attract and retain the right kind of people that are going to fit the culture. But there's this weird thing where companies try to pretend to be something that they're not. And that's when you get into the most danger.
It's managing expectations. And I think, speaking to me as a recruiter, I know that all too well. One of the number one reasons people leave is managing of expectations, which again goes back to honesty. So you work as a business coach, obviously coaching people across a whole range of different industries. What is it that you tend to find the successful traits that people who've really risen to the top in any industry seem to have? From your experience of working in different businesses and, having exposure across the board, what is it that you tend to find that, makes someone successful versus maybe someone who starts a business that doesn't make it to the top? What have you kind of learned over the years?
What an interesting question. I think listen, mindset's everything, first of all. I have a quote that's, entrepreneurship, leadership is 10% about business, 100% about people, and 1,000% about the self. And the entrepreneurs I've coached who have made it had a very unique and objectively honest mindset. The internal chatter went something like this: I have no idea whether I'm going to be successful or not. I have no idea exactly how I'm going to figure out this particular problem. But today and tomorrow and the day after, I'm just going to keep doing the activities that I know should eventually lead to success. And they have that attitude, and they take those actions without the emotional involvement that my least performing clients have. The least performing
Mm.
ones come from a place of I'm going to be a millionaire, and there's a sort of desperate emotional plea that goes into their vision of the future, right? And because they're obsessed with that vision, they actually fail. They block themselves from just doing the objective daily in the trenches work.
Do you
Fascinating.
think it's the focus of what people are actually focusing on, their core value? Because I guess some of it's focusing on, I want to be a millionaire, and solely focusing on the money and the byproduct is missing maybe the focus of delivering the great service or focusing on the product. I guess if James Dyson just focused on cutting profit margins and having a Hoover that was the cheapest in parts, regardless of your view on Dyson Hoovers, then maybe he wouldn't have, come up with a Hoover that was revolutionary at the time. Do you think it's about focusing on the right thing in business then?
I think it's partly on focus, but I think it's a
Mm.
lot to do with belief. Belief in self, and really being comfortable with like who you are and what you want, and most importantly, what it's going to take to get there. And the last part is the part I think people love to lie to themselves about:
Which is?
what it takes to get there. You know,
Oh, right. Okay.
like, oh,
Okay.
okay, I'm hearing, so I want to build $1 million company. I did $10,000 in sales this past week.
Mhm.
There are a million things that could be wrong, right? But one of the things that's usually wrong is they haven't thought through their business model to even understand what makes $1 million company, right? Like what business model, what kind of customer, what kind of profits, what kind of process do you even need to have to get to 7 figures or 8 figures or so on and so forth? Most haven't even done that kind of work. They're like, oh,
Mm.
I made $10,000. Next stop, million. And it's like, that's not honest. That's not the.
Is what drives you these days the same as what drove you when you was at the, those early days of you being in your early 20s growing a business, or has your kind of drivers changed as you've got, progressed more in your career and got wiser and maybe older and so on?
Yeah, I imagine like anyone,
Mm.
my drivers have totally changed. I've started to ask myself different questions now because I went through my sort of crisis of 30 and had this deep feeling like I hadn't done enough, and so I set out some really big goals for myself. One of them was write a book and TEDx talk. I had a bunch of them, and literally like this past summer when I launched Honest to Greatness, those are now all done.
Mm.
So
Okay.
I was like, oh,
What's
now,
next?
yeah, well, now what the hell do I do? And it really made me it forced me to reflect back on like all the cycles that I've now endured. And what's interesting that I've learned about time and reflection is after going through not one, but two and three sort of cycles of life where things sort of come
Mm.
and cycle through and move on to the next thing. It's like, okay, in a world where there are only more cycles and then more cycles, it's not about like, oh, if I don't climb this mountain, I'm a failure. It's like, well, there's plenty of other mountains and there's plenty of other ways to define failure and success. And so, it's just sort of broadened the way I look at all kinds of things. And it's made me ask a very important question, which I like everyone to ask, which is what would be even better than that? I feel like in my 20s, I was so like closed minded. It's like, oh, build multi-million-dollar company, right? I could have
Yeah.
stopped to ask myself, like, what would be even better than that? And then I probably would have come up with build a multi-million-dollar company while living on the beach in Mexico. And, it would have had like other criteria, And so I want people to sort of take those blinders off, realize that their
Mm.
self-limiting BS oftentimes can help them achieve success, only for them to see that like, oh, success could have been so much better. I really failed to define it.
How do you define success?
I define it as a feeling. Yeah, I've come to define it as a feeling now. Like if you feel
Mhm.
successful, you're successful. That's it. Stop.
I think that's a great explanation. I
Well, I
think it's
wouldn't have.
individual.
The thing is, Jason, I wouldn't have believed that like 10 years ago, right? You could have told me that. I could have heard that on a podcast, and I would have been like, "What an idiot that guy is." you know? I had
Right.
to learn that the hard way.
I think you do in your 20s. I think you do. I think sometimes it takes to get into your 30s and 40s to realize that. And, my definition of it has changed as I've got older. I tie it into happiness now is how I define success. We're coming up to the end of our time together. I'm really enjoying this conversation, but we have a lot of people who listen to this show who are starting out in business, who, are maybe graduating from college, university, or people who are starting up businesses and kind of in those early stages of the journey now. Obviously, the one thing we can take away from this conversation is definitely honesty. But what advice would you give to people who are maybe starting out on this business journey, being in a much wiser and a much more kind of advanced stage in your career now?
It's so simple to go and find a mentor who's done what you're trying to do and ask them. Here's what I find happens, right? Because I've literally mentored like hundreds of entrepreneurs now. What happens is first-time entrepreneur gets idea, thinks their idea is the most amazing thing in the world, sets about doing the idea, and it crosses their mind at some point, like maybe I should ask someone who's done this before, like a more successful entrepreneur, like what I should do and what I should change, and they don't. And the reason why they don't is just pure ego. They don't want to hear that their idea may suck. They don't want to hear that the things they put in motion probably aren't the best use of their time or resources and that they may want to do these other things over here. You asked me about most successful clients and not. Like the most successful clients, I say, do this, this, and that. I had a client a couple of years ago. He was balancing a family business and he had sort of moved away from that and he was trying to launch his own thing. And the business he was trying to launch was a terrible business. I mean, it was just a bad business model. And I told him that. I was like, that's a bad business model. I was like, tell me about your family business. He said, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. I was like, I really want to be an entrepreneur and prove myself. And I was like, listen, that family business is a great business. They're willing to have you. Go prove yourself there. The only reason you won't do that is because of ego, is because you sit there and you say to yourself, no, I can't build on what someone else did. I got to do my own thing. And it was difficult for him, but he took my advice. And 3 years later, he's a multimillionaire. And he said, Peter, I never, how do I thank you? I mean, I really needed to hear that because it was in my own head. And it's not that hard, right? There are certain things that make a business great. There are certain things an entrepreneur should be doing, and 90% of the things entrepreneurs do, they should not be doing at all. And if you are honest enough to hear those things, you too will be successful. Just make sure you don't let your ego get involved.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think for me, I didn't necessarily reach out to people in the early stage of my career because I think I was sort of thinking no one's going to give me the time of day, me going to more experienced people. But I think now I've got older and wiser myself, I realise that actually a lot of the time people are all too willing to help. But, I think mine was probably lacking ego was the reason I didn't go to people.
Yeah, could be. There's so many mentor groups now out there. I mean, there's LinkedIn. There's people love to help, especially people who have done the trenches, and gone tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars into debt doing the wrong stuff. They're happy to help you avoid that.
Yeah, I agree. On a closing note, Peter, if people want to find out more about you and your TEDx talks and the book, where can they go to?
Sure. So come have an honest conversation at honesttogreatness.com. That's honesttogreatness.com. There you can take the 21-question honesty quiz. It's totally free. It'll tell you your honesty profile if you're brave enough to find out. Yeah, it's free 21-question quiz. And it gets you into the material. And of course, pick up a copy of Honest to Greatness wherever books are sold. Grab them for your team. It's really great to work through, with your work team or with your company. And if you want to buy some books through me, I'll actually do a little half-hour workshop with your team as well.
Oh, fantastic.
If you'd like. Yep, you can do all there. Just my only warning is try not to get a copy for someone and hand it to them with a wink and be like, oh, you really need this one. That probably won't go over well.
No, I can imagine that's probably not the best way to start the engagement process of the journey to honesty is to insinuate a level of dishonesty.
Yeah.
Listen, Peter, it's been absolutely lovely to speak to you. For anyone that does want to find out more, they can also go to your website, can't they? peterkozodoy.com.
Yeah, Honest to Greatness goes right there, and it's easier to remember.
Oh, right. Okay, fantastic. Peter, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It's been enlightening. It's been really refreshing to hear your views. And that's it for this episode of the Career Success Podcast. Do join me another time. I'm Jason Connolly. Thanks very much.